Welcome back to Unleashed at Work and Home. I'm very excited to have Casey McGee joining me today. We're going to be talking about control. So Casey, welcome to Unleashed at Work and Home.
Hi, Colleen. Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you about control because I found your background really interesting. So before you were a dog trainer and now you're the owner of Upward Hound in Star Prairie, Wisconsin, you work to prevent violence against women. Isn't that correct?
Right.
So can you tell me a little bit about that work?
Yeah, it was, I think before I became a dog trainer, that was probably the most profound work I had ever done, personally as well as professionally. We looked at kind of battering, domestic violence and sexual assault as being something that kind of happens. It's a cultural phenomenon, not an individual phenomenon. And we worked on institutional reform, basically helping police departments and prosecutors' offices and so forth change the way that they responded to violence against women so that the outcomes for women were better. Because those systems, historically, they weren't developed to kind of process this kind of crime. So, but then also on the side, I facilitated men's groups or batterers groups for men who had been convicted of sometimes misdemeanor, sometimes felony domestic violence crimes, who had been court ordered to come to these. You've probably heard of like anger management classes. Mm-hmm. Well, this is kind of like the modern version of what they used to call anger management. It's no longer anger management these days. It's kind of a re-education model, or it's a facilitation model. So now I would facilitate those classes. And as part of the training for that, I had to think through the way kind of personally I use control. I use power and control in my life, in my private relationships, in my friend relationships, at work. And it was just because there's very little. It's kind of it's all on a spectrum, basically. So anyway, so I don't want to get too far down that road, but it was a fascinating kind of a personal transformation for me to not see it as there are those of us who are pristine and pure and happy and everything in our relationships, and then there are those who are evil and coercive and all they do is bad, or and that's not the experience of anybody. Everybody's human. They were along this spectrum. So
right.
It was very transformative for me. And I think I brought that kind of perspective into dog training, these kind of notions of what do we allow ourselves to do as intimate partners? What do we allow ourselves to do in relationship with a dog in order to achieve the outcome that we want? How far are we willing to go? And do we want to kind of be conscious about that? So
mm-hmm. I love your tagline, all carrot, no stick. No kidding.
No kidding.
I love that. I think it's just genius. So let's talk a little bit about control. So we do have ideas of needing to control someone else. In some cases, our dog, or in the cases of your previous clients, their partners.
Or our kids.
Right. So what are the things that make us feel like we need to control others?
Well, I always if you think about it like in behavioral analysis terms, I never thought of control as being a primary reinforcer. If you remember, like primary versus secondary reinforcers, mm-hmm. I never really thought of it as being an end in and of itself. I feel like it as being a means to an end that I'm entitled to. And I know that feels like I'm kind of splitting hairs there, but I remember, I think a lot of kind of what that goes down is that people see, batterers or people who use force or violence against their dogs or against their children as that they're power hungry, or that they have this need to control. And I've never, that's personally never made that much sense to me. And that's not at least what I would see in men's groups, is I see it as it's actually a means to an end. Mm-hmm. So it's a means to an end that I'm entitled to because of who I am in this culture. So people own dogs, right? Parents own children, for better or for worse. Men don't own women anymore, but nonetheless, the long history of men kind of being, all of us have been taught that men are smarter and stronger and braver and, all these different things. And we've incorporated that into our thinking culturally for better or for worse. And if you're the smarter person in a relationship, you get to make all the budget decisions because somebody's got to do it, right? And it should be the smarter person. And if you're the less histrionic person, if you're the more objective person in a relationship, you should make all the hard decisions. You know what I mean? Because you're the one who's the big thinker. You're the one who's got your finger on the pulse of how the world comes together. And it should fall on you to make those decisions. It just makes sense. So having control over the people in your family is the way that you kind of make sense of the world. It's the way that you hold your family together. You're the one who understands how the world is put together. So therefore, you're going to teach and show the rest of your family and make sure that they conform. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it's often sort of a little bit of fear, like at least from my perspective, of that I need to try to control all these variables because there is so much going on, and because I have a path and I can see the path. If we would all just get on this path, everything would work out fine.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, right. In all the research they've done on men who batter, there are very strong gendered notions in their belief system and in their family of origin around men are more this way and women are more this way. And there's kind of a lot of thinking around who should do what kind of role. That's just one of the few, across all class and culture and societal lines. That's actually one of the very strong correlations, is that there's a very strong belief about the difference between genders.
I heard an idea recently that was new to me, so I'm interested to know what you think about it. I heard someone say that one of our challenges in gender roles is that manhood is something that men are continually having to earn and that it can be lost, whereas women aren't always trying to prove their womanhood. They just are. They just
Isn't
know
that interesting?
Yeah, it was an interesting thought, and I thought that could explain so much of the idea of competition and, don't be such a wuss, come on, men don't cry, all of these pieces of this idea of that if you don't conform to society's idea of what male behavior is or should be, maybe you're not a real man. And so it's like...
That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know what that makes me think of, and I'm not going to quote this properly, but I've learned so much of what I know from Jean Donaldson, being a graduate of the Academy. And she kind of tries to deconstruct this notion of dominance between dogs, and why humans are so obsessed with dominance. Like no matter how many times that's been kind of debunked, the pack leader thing, like people still just gravitate to this notion. It's like, we just can't help ourselves. And I think that she said that there is a correlation between your the hierarchical structure of you as a person, like where you are in the hierarchy, your status, and your reproductive success. So there's a strong correlation with that, of people going back through the generations. And so it makes sense that we'd be obsessed with hierarchy. And so as a man, your reproductive, it's just going to be, if I'm remembering this right and quoting right, which I'm probably not, but there's going to be some part of your DNA that just makes you crave being on top of the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're humans. Being a woman, women aren't going to be immune from this either.
Right. And so when we're looking at control, it's related to both power and trust. So the elements of those come in where, you can get a sense of control by kind of taking control and taking action, which is about power. But you can also have a sense of control if you trust others. Like, what they're going to do.
Oh, interesting.
And you have some certainty and security in the moment.
Right, which relates to safety. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't really thought of that before, but I can see that perspective. I know what you mean.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was thinking about talking to you, that I think that when we're reaching for control, it often is from a spot of a little bit of anxiety or a little bit of fear. Like something's not going to go well if I don't manage all these variables. And in fact, in one of my Unleashed Resilience groups, one of the women was talking about when she feels good, she's much looser and things go better and life is good. And when she's stressed, one of her main stress signs is she suddenly starts micromanaging herself and everyone around her.
That's right, because she has to nail everything down.
Yeah. And that control is her way of trying to feel better, but it doesn't actually make her feel better because she's just so busy trying to play whack-a-mole with her life.
Right. Yeah. That makes very intuitive sense to me. I completely get that. Yeah.
I thought it was a really interesting idea when she shared it because I could see that. Honestly, I can see that in my own life at times too, where I am just a little bit stressed and I think, well, I'll just take care of everything that I can take care of.
Yeah.
All the pieces I can control, I will control.
There is control, and I don't mean to make too fine a point of it, but I think that it's really important to differentiate between what you're talking about. Like, all of us experience this need to have control. We need to be able to have control in our relationships, have control over our finances, have control over whether or not our home heats in the cold. You know, we need to have control over these things. But the extent to which we are willing to coerce, intimidate, or use pain or violence against others is permission that we give ourselves to have a certain amount of control, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit like batterers are men with hard mouths, if you know what I mean. So there are, you know how they'll say in dogs, you know, all dogs will resource guard. Well, most dogs will resource guard to some extent. Some will do it with inhibited force and some will do it with uninhibited force. And that's a little bit the equivalent of. So it's not so much the urge to control, it's to what extent, like, what will you do to get it and what will you do to keep it?
Right.
That's what differentiates all the rest of us from people who batter in a relationship. And that's what differentiates dogs with soft mouths from hard mouths. And that's what differentiates, like, you know, there are some people online, when they get insulted, they'll flame everybody in sight, right? And then there are some people who, when they get insulted, they'll just quietly pack up and leave, right? So it's to what extent are you willing, or do you feel entitled to retaliate, to hurt others, to use pain against others? That's what I think is the difference. It's not. I don't think control itself is the issue. It's what permission we give ourselves to achieve it. And I think that's really a parallel in dog training as well. So it's not so much, do dogs have the right to vote, or do they have rights as animals? And all of us are going to have different opinions along these lines. Is what right do we have as humans against another species living in our home? And then what kind of a relationship does that leave us with? If that makes sense.
That makes great sense. So let's talk a little bit about that.
So the willingness to use pain, intimidation, fear changes your relationship fundamentally. And this was something we would hear from men in groups. And I'll get back to dog training in just a second. But this is kind of what always gave me insight into dog training and also into myself as a dog owner back when I did use force, is men in groups would sometimes have these epiphanies, and these were kind of like real moments of change where they would realize they might not have ever known fully that their wife wanted to be with them sexually. Their relationship was so governed by violence and coercion and manipulation that, reflecting back on it, their hearts broke a little bit, thinking that they never really knew if their wives were fully there with them, consenting. They never really trusted that whether they didn't really know whether or not their children loved them or respected them out of fear and were secretly just afraid of them. They didn't know this. And it was heartbreaking to look around you and realize kind of what those choices have done to the relationships in your life. And those will kind of be I think that's way more inspiring for people to change than a criminal conviction, you know. But thinking back on that in my own life as a person who used to use, you know, force with my dog, it was the main tool I thought I had, and it fundamentally damaged my relationship with my dog. And these days with my clients, when I go into someone's home and they've been using a shock collar to handle counter surfing, or using a shock collar to handle, you know, jumping up on guests, they're not thinking of themselves as, I need to have control over this dog. They're thinking this is a means to an end. And that's not the kind of person they want to be, though. That's not the kind of relationship they ultimately want to have with their dog, because they adore their dogs, or they wouldn't be hiring a trainer, right? They adore their dogs, and they just need a way to kind of figure out how to have a different kind of relationship with them. It's just not who they want to be.
Right. And so let's look at it from that perspective. So if in our human relationships, we're not showing up as who we want to be, you know, just a little bit more prickly or controlling or fussy or whatever it is that we're doing, and thinking about it from this perspective, what would be a suggestion that you have to try to help mentally reframe some of that, to have kinder and gentler interactions with coworkers and clients and other humans that we encounter?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't really know. I think that, personal change. I'm very good at talking about other people about personal change. Wow. I don't, for me at least, and maybe this is just kind of the way I put myself together, is I'd have to think through I get very kind of intellectual and I start thinking through. So, I did this to somebody and what gave me the right to do it or not really, what made me think that I could do that it was okay for me to do that. And then kind of trying to deconstruct that in my brain is no longer giving myself permission to do that. So I don't know if that makes sense. It's a matter of identifying, what I did was hurtful. I don't want to do that anymore. And then thinking through, but why is it so compelling in that moment? Why do I feel like I can give myself permission to do it in that moment and then not give myself permission to do that anymore? So basically just kind of like changing my own contingencies, changing my own rules inside. I no longer have permission to do this. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but I think I could be a strange creature. I'm not sure that other people would think of personal change this way. Like, what about you? Like, I'm sure, because we've all had this experience of we've done or said something that we really regret, right?
Right.
So, like, how do you go about reworking that in your head and thinking, I'm not going to do that again? How do you? It's hard.
It is hard, and that's the whole point of Unleashed at Work and Home, is we wrestle with the hard stuff and figure out where we figure out. For me, I try to think about, well, what do I wish happened, and try to reverse engineer from there. So, okay, that result was not what I wanted or intended, but that's what I got. Well, what could I do differently? But I love your idea of really looking at what may have inspired me to act that way, what gave me permission in my head to act that way. Because I think it's a deeper level. It's a deeper level to look at it that way.
And don't we have to also give ourselves the tools to do something different? Like, if you think about creating a DRI or an incompatible behavior for a dog who's under stress, to do something different, you have to practice in a non-stressful environment. So for us as well, right? Mm-hmm. If I want to quit, it used to be that when my dogs would argue or fight, I would scream or yell and kick out of fear and adrenaline and right. And if I want to give myself different tools and different ways of responding to that's calmer and, more productive, I need to practice that out of that stressful context. So I wonder if that's a part of it too, is kind of very deliberately giving ourselves an alternative behavior and putting it into our repertoire deliberately. So it's not theoretical anymore, but we actually have to practice it somehow out of context. Yes. So that we're fluent at it when the context gets tough.
Yes. And that's so funny that you say it that way, because that's what the Unleashed Resilience groups are all about. Because it's a chance for us to get together and explore like this technique and then practice it in a small group situation and go, that felt really awkward and weird to me, or, oh, I loved that one. So that we've tried it on, basically in the dressing room and said, how can I use this? And then now that I've had a chance to practice it a little bit, now this week I'm going to try it in real life and see how it goes and build from there. So it's interesting how you're saying it from that perspective, because we really do need to find safe ways to build and strengthen new behavior patterns. Because if we feel uncomfortable doing them, then we just go back to our fixed patterns, and that doesn't get us where we want to go.
Right. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about the parallels you see between your work with dogs now and your previous work.
I think the most fundamental thing is kind of approaching the work with a very strong sense of equanimity, being that there's not me who I'm always compliant and I always do what I'm supposed to, and I always floss my teeth, and I always pay my taxes on time, and I always do my homework. And then clients out there who are non-compliant and, uncooperative. There's not like a big difference between me and other people. There's not a big difference in terms of how much we love our dogs and how much and kind of who we want to be as people in the world. how we want to be perceived by others. I mean, there's so many parallels between me and, the families I work with. We're all just the same. And in batters groups, the facilitators were very, very much positioned that way as well. I had done things in relation. I had never used violence against somebody in a relationship, but I had done and said hurtful things, and that's all on a spectrum. So, so really being able to kind of look at that, it's really there, but for the grace of God, so there's a kind of being able to, there's not an us and them really out there. It's really just, I happen to have an education, and I happen to have different tools, and, let's try this out. I know you want change, or you wouldn't have called me. So, so I guess the difference is that my clients aren't court ordered to work with me. Wouldn't that be funny if they were court ordered dog owners groups? No, that wouldn't be funny at all. That wouldn't be productive.
No, but you'd be the perfect one to run them, because you would know how to set it up and get it started from that perspective, because they would come in feeling very judged. And you're right that none of us has made it through without saying or doing something that we wish we hadn't.
Right. And with our dogs or our children or our partners or right. Yeah. Something else that I really, really learned from my other work is that the language we use to describe another person or another dog is really, really key. So men who batter will oftentimes use really, really degrading language in their relationships. And so this seems like a bit of a leap, but bear with me. In our relationship with our dogs, I think that the parallel there is just describing dogs as being stubborn or retaliative or spiteful. Was it Patricia McConnell, I think, who said that, isn't it funny, we don't really understand dog emotions, but when we try to, when we're guessing, we always guess the worst human emotion. Like, we don't guess, generosity and forbearance and patience and compassion. We guess this whole negative pile of stuff, right? And when we see dogs as being retaliative or stubborn, it leads us to a different kind of a solution or a different kind of an action. Usually it's that we want to break them in some way, right? Then, and it's the same thing in describing partners, like the language that we use to describe dogs. And so I'm always really, really paying attention to that with myself and with my clients, is how are we conceptualizing of this problem? Because how we conceive of it is going to lead us to different outcomes, So I don't correct people in their thinking about it, but I'm just always trying to reframe in terms of what the dog's motivation is,
Yes.
Which is also something that we learned from Jean. But it's just kind of like the importance of language and how we talk about
it is. It's really important. And that reminds me of a veterinarian that I was talking to who said that in her practice, the policy is we talk kindly about owners, whether there's anyone here to hear or not. And she said she came into the break room one day and heard one of her nurses just bashing an owner, just like, what were they thinking? Why didn't they do a better job with their dog? Why did they wait so long? And she said, thank you so much for your service, but we don't do that here. And this was not this person's first, so it wasn't like a one and done, but she was like, this is not our practice. We don't do that. And so when you're talking about the language and how that can harm relationships, she said she realized that it wasn't just, can the clients hear? It's, is this occurring in my practice? Even in the break room, language was important.
That just gave me goosebumps. Yeah. Yeah, that's so powerful. A friend of mine is a Montessori teacher and has been, for as long as I've known her. And it occurred to me for the first time a couple of years ago, and I asked her about it. She was the only teacher I had ever met who didn't complain about her students. And she said, no, we don't do that in our school. And I actually don't know anything about Montessori. I don't know if that's a regular practice or if this is just her school or what. But like, even students who are very behaviorally challenging, there's no complaining, there's none. I mean, it's all, and it's just, I think she said that it helps her from kind of getting dragged down around the issue. It keeps her kind of focusing positively, and yet there are some though I think that some who really feel like venting is a it's a therapeutic thing for professionals to be able to do. So the jury for me is out on that, but I think so too. For me personally, the language that I use absolutely changes the way that I treat people.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I do agree too that there can be a time and a place for venting, but you may have to decide that is your outside of work time if you work in this particular vet's practice or whatever.
That's right.
Because yes, there is a value to that, but venting also can get to the point where we're just rehashing the same stuff.
Yeah.
And then that's where we get the us versus them. Why are they like this?
Exactly.
Why are they doing
Exactly.
this? Why are people so stupid kind of stuff? And we do see that go in certain groups where it becomes just sort of an entrenched idea.
I wonder if that's anathema. I wonder if that brings up compassion fatigue. I don't know that much about compassion fatigue, but I know that that's something that you've really thought a lot about and paid a lot of attention to. Do you think there's a connection there?
I do think there's a connection there. I think it goes both ways. I think when we're starting to experience compassion fatigue, it's almost self-protective to say, ugh, them,
Yes.
But it's a difficult situation because we do encounter a lot of people who don't know the things we know. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves that our, friendly neighborhood plumber could walk in our house and go, I cannot believe you have the settings on your pipes on the wrong setting, or you haven't insulated them properly. And I'd be like, I don't know anything about that. Well, how could you not know? Everybody knows this is important. You could Google it. Well, that's what we do to people about dogs all the time. We're like, you should know this. You should know. But yeah, it does. I think language is a big piece of that, and really looking at that people are trying their best with what they know and what they have available in their own bandwidth at this moment. And that ties into what you were saying about the control parts, where, these people were doing what they did because they felt entitled, but also because they felt maybe even responsible to lead or have an outcome, that needs to be this way. It should be this way.
And violence is a regrettable but necessary evil. If this hurts me more than it hurts you kind of thing that parents used to tell their kids before they spanked them. That's, very much, I think if I ever catch myself thinking that, I'm going to know that's a red flag. I'm giving myself permission in that moment to do something that I don't think I should be doing. Giving yourself permission by thinking this is a necessary means to an end. This is a necessary evil. That's, for me, like there's a red flag around that.
Yeah. Well, and then they say, like, any sort of active aggression is reinforcing to the aggressor. So you yell at your children to knock it all off, and it feels so good for you, and you're like, whew, relief. That it becomes a little bit like, okay, next time this might be my go-to because it felt good to me in that moment. It did not actually improve my relationship with my children or make things better in the long run, but it felt awfully good in that moment.
I know. You get that zing.
Yeah. And we are wired internally that way. Like, we're very aware of what our bodies are doing. That zing matters.
It does, yeah. That's for sure, right.
So just from the perspective of like locus of control, things I can control versus things I cannot control, what would you say are some of the things that people should look at that are within their control? Like, if you're going to focus on the things you can control, where is your circle of influence, in your opinion?
Yeah. And do you mean like in relationship, like with our partners or like with our dogs? What are you thinking?
I think you can go in any direction you want to, because really it's all about just helping people learn new things. So whatever makes you happy.
Okay. It brings me, we were talking earlier before we started about that really great video about consent and a cup of tea that you had seen. And if anybody hasn't seen this, you've got to Google consent cup of tea. It's this really amazing little cartoon kind of a thing that outlines it compares consent in a sexual relationship to making somebody a cup of tea. So in this, if you use that model, the control that you have is you can ask someone if they want a cup of tea, right? And we do this with dogs. We offer them a contract. I'd like to file your nails. Would you hand me your paw for a piece of chicken? And they'll say no. Okay, well, can I touch your paw for a piece of, you know what I mean? So like you do this kind of constant negotiation. What can I do? And that to me is is the amount of control that we have, is the control over kind of figuring out what we want and forming kind of like these formal and informal contracts with other people around our behavior and their behavior. Like, here's what I'd like to do. What would you like to do? And here's what I'm going to offer you for this. And being willing to take no for an answer. We talk about dogs needing to have this skill all the time with each other. I know that this seems like I'm not talking that much about control, but for some reason it feels connected to me. This, like, that's really the extent of the control I have is I get to say, you know, I'd like you to walk next to me on a leash without pulling. What do you think? I'd like to offer you this for that. Is that worth it to you? Is that enough to change your behavior or not?
Right. Which puts us in a position of being persuasive influencers. So we don't decree
and strategic.
Yeah, we're not decreeing this will happen, but we're saying, wouldn't it be awesome if, and showing you how awesome that could be.
That's right.
Yeah. I think those are awesome suggestions, and I'll definitely link to the cup of tea in the show notes so that people can find that easily.
And beware in advance of they swear. So beware in advance if there's some, pardon their French.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the warning on that. So if people wanted to learn more about you and your work, where could they find out more?
Well, Upward Hound, my dog training business, has a website, of course, upwardhound.com. But anyone who's an aspiring dog trainer should absolutely check out the Academy for Dog Trainers, where I'm happy to say I provide a supportive role. Yeah, so that's academyfordogtrainers.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on today, Casey, to talk to me about control. This has been a really interesting discussion.
Me too. Thank you so much. It's been fun.
Thanks. Do you want to feel stronger, happier, and more resilient? Let's face it, who doesn't? Check out the new Unleashed Resilience Skills Groups. They're online, small group sessions that are guaranteed to improve your outlook on life. Visit ColleenPilar.com for more info.